Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is entitled Placement Decisions and Home-Based Instruction. Our presenter for today is Paul Sherman. Paul has been in the Department of Public Instruction Special Education team since 2007. He holds degrees in post-secondary education and law from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you today Paul Sherman. Paul?
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope that what we work through today you will find useful. As Bonnie said, our topic is on placement decisions and home-based instruction. This is one of those topics that I like to talk to as many people as I can because the issues are difficult and the procedural compliance requirements under IDEA and state special education law relating to home-based placements are pretty complex. And it's to the benefit of our students if everybody can understand what's at stake here and what needs to be done to make these types of placements appropriate and work on behalf of our student. So it helps when we can have school staff, advocates, parents, and in some cases the students themselves all pulling on the same oars in the same direction to get the job done, again, based on what's in how we can best meet the needs of our students with disabilities. When we arranged to do this presentation, it was before the current pandemic situation arose. So what I'm going to do in terms of today's presentation is sort of take this in two parts. The first part will talk about these types of placements and placement decisions as we would under normal circumstances. And then we'll be talking a little bit about the implications of the pandemic for home-based placements, because we do know that we have lots of students who are learning at home. Some districts are providing that as an option for parents. Some parents would like the district to consider that as an option given the pandemic considerations, and we'll deal with that in the second part of today's presentation. First, a bit of an issue with terminology here. Oftentimes people refer to students with disabilities who are receiving their education at home through the provision of their IEP as students who are receiving homebound instruction. That's a term that I'm not particularly in favor of using as applied to those students, because homebound instruction is a general education concept which is open to all students. It's something that's mentioned in the state statute on compulsory school attendance. And it's basically a service that's available to students who have been excused from attendance by the school because they have a temporary health problem that makes it so that they are unable to attend school. Maybe they have a communicable disease that is going to take a substantial amount of time to recover from. Perhaps they've had a ski accident and have a broken leg, which requires them to be at home and unable to attend school in person. Things like that, which keep them away from school. Not necessarily a disability-related issue, just one of those things that can befall all of us and make it difficult for us to be in a certain place. The homebound instruction that's specified in the compulsory school attendance statute is not mandatory. In other words, parents can request that and the district can comply with that request or not within its own discretion. Certainly students with disabilities are eligible to participate in homebound instruction just as any other student would. And I suppose we could imagine some situations where a student with a disability, maybe with minimal services in their IEP, the family might just opt to request homebound instruction during a temporary period when the student is unable to attend school, and they should be allowed to make that request and receive those services if the district determines it's appropriate. If you are looking for more information on this homebound instruction, I've provided a link there on the slide. We do have a publication from our Student Services Prevention and Wellness team that lays out the the legal ins and outs of homebound instruction. Because this is not a FAPE related issue, when we're talking about students who have IEPs, I think it's best not to use the term homebound instruction. What we want to talk about is where the IEP team determines that the student's appropriate placement is at the home, this being an IEP team decision. It's a matter of what the student needs to receive a free appropriate public education, or FAPE. The IEP team makes that placement determination based on the student's individual disability-related needs. So once again, this is about that student's individual needs when we're talking about placement at home. Okay. Because the student's home is not the regular education environment as we think of that, there's a very significant LRE consideration that needs to be analyzed before we place a student at their home. Now, for those of you who have not dealt with the LRE question before, this is specified in the IDEA regulations, and it basically says, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled. Okay. This is a big presumption in the law that this is the place we start with all of our students who are eligible under IDEA, that we educate them to the maximum extent appropriate with children who are non-disabled, right? This is not, it's a stop and think requirement. It's not a prohibition on educating students in environments other than the regular education classroom with children who are non-disabled. But it is a presumption that this is where we should start. This should be our goal for all of our students, to see that they are educated in that environment rather than other environments. Okay. The second part of LRE is removal from the regular educational environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So this is the why question that we oftentimes refer to when we're thinking about placing a student outside of that regular education environment. We need to be able to explain why we can't achieve the student's education satisfactorily in that regular education environment with the use of supplementary aids and services. Okay. Kind of the other end of this discussion, and it's what I mentioned earlier, which is that the LRE is not saying you must educate all students in the regular ed environment, is the notion also contained in the regulations that schools have to make available instruction in regular classes, special schools, home instruction, and instruction in hospitals and institutions, and that's called the continuum requirement. So IDEA recognizes that while the regular education environment is the preferred environment for students, that not all students would benefit from being educated full-time in that regular environment, and that there are some students whose needs might be better met in other environments. Okay. So how do we discuss the LRE in the context of home-based placement, right? At some point, for a particular student, somebody, parent, school staff, advocate, might think, uh, this is what we're doing in the regular school environment just isn't working for the student. Should we be considering some other type of placement? We're focusing today on placements that might be at home, but the placement could under consideration could be any of those other places that we just talked about on the previous slide with the continuum. So we might have that in mind, but we can't actually just go ahead and put the student in that environment because that's what we have in mind. We have to go through this analysis first to make sure that that environment that we have under consideration actually is the appropriate environment for the student. And this is the big why question, right? Why can't education in the regular education environment be achieved satisfactorily? Okay. And in order to do that, we have to consider some things. I think first thing that needs to be considered is what is currently working and not working in the student's placement in that regular education environment. And then we have to figure out why it is or is not working. Okay. Second question we need to consider is what additional supports and services could be provided to allow the child to be educated satisfactorily in that regular education environment. Okay, and why would those additional supports and services work, and why or why not? You notice that there's what's and whys all over this particular slide, and it really is important that you get to the bottom of those questions. Some of you have probably heard of our CCR IEP process that we've developed, and its emphasis on these types of critical questions in an IEP. We should be asking ourselves that why question at least 5 times, so that we really get to the root cause, what it is that we're confronting, what could we possibly do, why would a particular approach work or not work. So that, this is a hard thing for people just as a matter of nature to do, because the fact that you're having this conversation means that somebody already has in mind that something's not working and that a different environment might be better. In the case we're talking about today, that the home environment might be better. So the law, again, makes us stop and kind of question the assumptions that we've made, at least initially, to get us to the point where we say, well, maybe something might be better. We really have to figure out first, why isn't the current environment working? And what we could do differently within the context of the current environment. Once we rule all that stuff out, once we've really gotten to the core of that, and we still say, yep, whatever we do, that environment is not going to work, not going to be satisfactory for the student, then we start thinking about those alternative placements, like the home-based placement. Okay. A couple things to keep in mind here is that this aspect of the law doesn't require the school or the parents to try and fail, right? The IEP team is entitled to, as they're looking at what's been working, what hasn't been working, what might be things that could be additional supports and services that could be used. When you get to that question, you're entitled to use the expertise of the team, the data that you've collected, to rule out those additional things that might be tried as things that we're fairly certain wouldn't work. So there's no obligation to say, yes, we could do X, Y, and Z. We have to do those and the student has to fail at it before we can move on and consider other environments. While you don't have to try and fail, you do have to have the evidence, the logic, and have that discussion about why those particular things are unlikely to work based on what you know about the individual student's needs and the data that you have around that. Okay. The other thing that we are concerned about at the department, and I personally am concerned about, is thinking about teams doing placements outside the regular education environment when what's at issue is the student's behavior. Okay. Um, we want to encourage teams to use extra vigilance when they're examining placements outside the regular education environment because the student's behavior is at issue. And of course, the risk here is that the team needs to be extra cautious not to use the IEP process to mete out consequences for the student violating the school rules, when in fact the process is to be used to address the student's disability related needs. Okay. So I think it's, again, we never say never in special education. So an IEP team having a careful discussion about the LRE factors, the continuum, asking themselves seriously the why questions, coming up with good answer, good data. It's possible that a student's behavior related needs would call for a placement outside of the regular education environment for some or all of the school day. But again, you need to be very careful that the IEP process isn't switching over into the school discipline process, and that you're looking at the student's needs and not the needs of the school to maintain order in a particular classroom. Okay. In the process of having that discussion, there are certain procedural things that need to be documented in the student's IEP team, in the student's IEP document itself. And for me, as somebody who works at the Department of Public Instruction and is called on to, answer questions from parents and school districts about these types of issues, informally and through the formal IDEA complaint process, this documentation is very important to me because it's the evidence that the IEP team had the discussion that the placement determination requires. Okay, and there are several places um, in the IEP documents where we expect to see some evidence that that discussion occurred. In our model forms and in most IEP documents I've seen, generally in the program summary section, usually after that, there are a couple of questions that have to do with the least restrictive environment. Okay, one of those it asks the IEP team, is the student going to participate full time in the regular ed environment? You answer yes or no, and then it says if you answer no, the IEP team is to document their why. Basically, it's the question we've been reviewing up to this point. Why can't you educate the student satisfactorily in the regular education environment with the use of supplementary aids and services? Okay. It's important that that question be answered thoroughly and that it reflect the discussion that the IEP team had. It shouldn't just be kind of a conclusion, saying, well, the student is disabled, therefore they need these things which they can't get, therefore they're going to be removed from the regular ed environment. It really should be, substantially answering that why question. Also in that same section in the program summary, you need to document the extent of the student's removal from the regular education environment. Is it going to be for half a day, a whole day, half hour, whatever it happens to be? we need to see that, and that's part of that LRE discussion as well. On the placement notice that goes out every time we determine a student's placement, it asks the IEP team to document the other options considered and the reasons rejected. In my view, whenever the student is placed in a placement that's not in the regular education environment, it's mandated that the IEP team document other options considered, because you should, by nature of doing the LRE discussion, you are considering placement in the regular education environment, and you should be there documenting the reasons that that placement was rejected. And there would be where you would talk about, why placement in the regular education environment full-time hasn't worked to this point, why things that were considered as additional supports and services were rejected as things that would not reasonably address the student's needs. And then finally, in the IEP document, in the present levels, in our relatively new section, the IEP document, where we're asking the team to identify the disability-related needs, we really ought to see some evidence there, some data that shows, what is the problem with the student participating in the regular education environment? How is that connected to their disability-related needs? And, are you identifying disability-related needs that are clearly things that cannot be met in that regular education environment with the use of those supplementary aids and services? So this is not a simple task. It's going to take some time. I know that people are always pressed for time in IEPs. There are always other issues to be discussed, other matters to be settled. But we do expect that when this very significant issue about a placement in the student's home is under consideration, that there be a serious and substantial discussion about the LRE implications of that, and that those discussions get documented. This is an area where I frequently see problems as I get questions from folks and as I'm investigating IDEA complaints. And that is, once you've gone through all that work to determine an appropriate placement for a student, and you determine that the student should be placed at home, you do need to develop an IEP, right? And in that IEP, I think just by the nature of the placement determination that has been made, really can't just be the same one that the student had while their placement was reflected as being, in the regular education environment. Are the goals the same for a student who is in school as at home? Some of them are, but I would think there should be some that are different. Um, the related services, the supplementary aids and services, are you really going to be able to implement those in the way they're described in the student's current IEP when you're totally changing the student's environment? Providing speech and language therapy in the home is going to be different than it is in school. Maybe at school those services are provided in a small group of students. At home, you're probably going to be providing those one-on-one. We have all sorts of supplementary aids and services in IEPs that are really closely related to the environment that the student is in. Are they described appropriately for this new environment that the student is now going to be in at home? Length of day is something that needs to be considered. As a general matter, if students who are attending school are there for 5.5, 6 hours a day, there's a presumption that a student who's been at home, at least the starting point, should be receiving instruction, participating in their education just as much as their non-disabled peers or their disabled peers who are at school, meaning 5.5 to 6 hours a day. Of course, with students who are placed at home, oftentimes they are being placed at home because they have disability-related needs that relate to their physical stamina and things like that. So it's entirely reasonable that their hours of instruction might be a little bit shorter, but that's something that the IEP team needs to make that a conscious decision on an individualized basis and really think about why that is before you just drop into, well, the students at home, we're only providing, an hour and a half of services a day. You can't jump right to that point. You have to do some analysis and thinking about that. Also, it's important to recognize that a student who's placed at home is still expected to participate in and make progress in the general education curriculum. So you might have this placement that's in a very unschool-like environment, but the IEP still needs to address the students' needs as they relate to participating and making progress in the general education curriculum. Not just towards their IEP goals. And I think it's also fair to say that because of the presumption that the student should be in the regular education environment to the maximum extent appropriate, that the IEP ought to contemplate what the plan is for eventually returning the student to that regular education environment. We don't want to get in the position where we just say, okay, we've determined that the best placement for the student is at home. And that's just the way it's going to be until they get that regular high school diploma or reach the age of 21. There should be some contemplation about, why is it that we place the student at home? What services are we going to provide? And at least part of the goal, the kind of the purpose of providing those services should be allow the student to build the skills or whatever acquisition they need in order to come back to school and participate with their regular education peers. Of course, that plan for return should be reflected in the student's goals. It should probably be reflected on the placement page or someplace else, some sort of plan as to when the IEP team is going to meet again to consider the placement, to determine whether the student has made progress towards returning to a regular environment. And also, if you think about that in terms of developing a plan for return, you're going to want to set some sort of criteria. And I've actually been dealing with a case on this recently. And one of the reasons that we want that robust LRE discussion, where you identify what's working, what's not working, what you could try, why that would work, why it might not work, is because having a good, robust discussion at that point then informs the discussion about what this plan for return should look like, because you're zeroing in on data points that you can then use to determine what it's going to look like when the student is ready to come back to that regular education environment at school and not continue at home. All right. So with that, then let's talk a little bit about what this all looks like now that we're in this pandemic situation. Even before the coronavirus pandemic arose, we had several years back the H1N1 pandemic flu, and at that point, the U.S. Department of Education put out some guidance about, students learning at home when schools were closed, students learning at home when, this district elected to provide a virtual option, and students learning at home because the student would be unable to attend because they had been exposed to the H1N1 virus or were actually sick with the H1N1 virus. And what the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education program settled on that point was sort of this 10-day window, right? They said, well, if the student's going to be missing school for a 10-day period of time, 10 consecutive days, they were sort of thinking, well, that doesn't, necessarily raise FAPE implications. We've dealt with students being absent from school for that amount of time for a long time, and just, kind of treat that as you would, any other situation. But they said once that absence extends past that 10 consecutive day window, then it's starting to raise for students with disabilities who have an IEP concerns that they might not be receiving their free appropriate public education. Um, and at that point, after 10 days, um, you know, then the IEP team needs to start thinking about, does the student's IEP need modification? Do they need something beyond just kind of the general education supports that we normally provide students who are sick and absent from school, in order to be able to continue to make progress towards their regular education and special education goals. So that's kind of the starting point when this all landed us in March. Our department adapted that analysis. We think that 10 days is, good advice from OSEP. With the current pandemic, with our kind of quarantine periods or isolation periods being recommended by public health authorities at 14 days, we think there's reason to think that, if it's 14 days, okay, proceed as normal. If it exceeds that 14 cumulative days, then you need to start thinking about the IEP implications of that. So that's generally where that comes from. Now, that's not to say that there are students who have specific disability-related needs where you might need to think about the FAPE implications of an extended absence at less than 14 days. And parents and school districts and advocates should be talking about those students on an individual basis if they believe that there are concerns for that. This kind of 10 to 14 day issue is about general guidance about when, as a kind of a matter of course for all students with IEPs, we ought to start thinking about how we're going to deal with that absence from school. One of the other pandemic considerations is, what is the responsibility when the district presents parents with an option? And many of our districts did that this fall when they resumed education. They told parents basically they could have the option. Do you want your child to come for in-person instruction, or would you like to continue on with some type of virtual option? That option, if a district makes that available to all students, that option should be available to students with disabilities as well. They can make the choice as to whether they, parents want the student to come to school and participate in person, or whether the a student wants to have the child participate virtually. It would be sort of a discrimination matter for districts to just rule out one or the other of those options based on the student's disability status. Once a parent picks a particular option, then the IEP team needs to think about an appropriate IEP for the student based on the option that's picked. If the parent, picks the the virtual option, they don't want the student to be attending in person, then the IEP team needs to, discuss how they can provide FAPE to the student in that environment. It's the parent's choice there is tempered a little bit by the district's obligation to provide FAPE for the student. And if the IEP team decides that given all of the student's disability-related needs, the district is really unable to provide FAPE for the student, with all of the modifications and supports and in-person delivery of services that they can do at home, and it really can't meet all of the students' needs in that environment, then I think it's reasonable for the IEP team to determine that the student should reach, to make an in-person placement as opposed to the home-based placement that the parent chose through that option program. There will be parents who will disagree with that decision. And at that point, then the parent would have access to the dispute resolution options that that are available for all IEP type disputes. So the parent could request IEP facilitation or mediation. They could file a complaint, an IDEA state complaint with us if they felt that the district had violated some procedural requirement of special education law. And of course, the end option would be a due process hearing request. Okay. So the other pandemic consideration that we've got going is this issue of additional services. Okay. Because the school is closed to in-person instruction for all students, or the student has been, the IEP team has determined a home placement is appropriate for the student, but there are some services that can't be delivered. Once things get back to normal, so to speak, the IEP team is going to have an obligation to consider whether the student needs any additional services as a result of the fact that there was an optional home placement, or a required home placement because the student had to be quarantined, or school was shut down and it was all virtual. The IEP team needs at some point to sit down, examine what progress the student made, where the student currently is in terms of their progress in the regular education curriculum and towards their IEP goals, and determine whether the student needs any additional services through their IEP that would allow them to get back up to speed and be able to make the type of progress that's expected. Just as a practical matter, what I've noticed is this, has kind of dragged on from, March through the end of last school year, and now into this school year, and it looks certainly like it's going to continue well into the new year. The sort of additional services discussion becomes harder because the student still exists once things get back to normal in having to participate in all their regular education, all their existing special education, and now be thinking about additional services. The question becomes, well, there are only so many hours in the day, so many days in the week, and the benefit to additional services might sort of just logically start to be counterproductive to focus too much on that. And it's reasonable that an IEP team might make that kind of calculation, but still, from our perspective, that conversation has to happen. It still is an analysis that the IEP team needs to do, to determine what additional services might be necessary, and then go on and determine, what the best way to meet those needs for additional services is. Okay. So here I have linked for you that OSEP H1N1 guidance that I talked about. You can look at that for yourselves and kind of see where all of that got started. And then I hope at this point most of you have seen our uh, COVID extended school closure guidance. I've linked that there. That's become a very comprehensive document that deals not only with these placement issues, but with the additional services issues and the consent and how do you have IEP meetings virtually and all that those sort of issues that have been related to the pandemic. I always joke because I'm on the group of people that write that I think it's very helpful, and I hope it is. Um, but certainly, I think that's worth taking a look at. And if you do have any questions, comments, or feedback on that document, we're always happy to hear from anybody. If something is not clear to you, it's probably not clear to other people, and we're always looking to clarify what's in that guidance. Right. So that's, I've walked you through the process. I'm happy to take questions now if anybody has questions. I also invite you to give me a call at the department or send me an email if additional questions come up. You can think about them later beyond today's presentation. So with that, Bonnie, I guess, have you received any questions yet that we could answer at this point?
Yes, Paul, we have several. The first
Okay.
one is, as the pandemic continues, is there any difference between compensatory services versus additional services? And then
Hmm.
the person says, and it's kind of confusing when you see both of them. Why do you use additional versus compensatory?
Right. So, compensatory services are, it's a term that comes out of the due process area. And it's usually, uh, a remedy where the due process hearing officer has determined that the student has been deprived of FAPE. Okay. So what are we going to do to compensate for that loss of FAPE? We use the term additional services at this point because primarily in relationship to the closure last spring, where all schools were closed to in-person instruction. And at that point, the feeling was that was not quite akin to a situation where a district had the ability to provide the student with FAPE and didn't through their own carelessness, negligence, stubbornness, whatever leads to the provision of not providing FAPE to a student. So the additional services in that sense are a recognition that the conditions that caused changes in the way we provide instruction to all students, how we had access to students because of various, restrictions about being in person, social distancing, all that kind of stuff was not quite the same. So we use that term to address that type of situation. Okay. Now, since we're in a new situation this year, where we don't have a statewide school closure, it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. Some schools are closed by a local county health order. Some schools are closed by choice. Some schools are offering that, in-person option or the virtual option. I think we're now getting back more to the situation where the expectation is that the districts do have the ability to provide FAPE. And in situations where, through a due process hearing or through the a resolution of a complaint, it might be more appropriate now to start thinking about the term compensatory services again. But it really, I think, has to do with the kind of the circumstances of the whole pandemic.
Okay, and I have another question for you. What is the expectation re those students who are just not able to learn at home? Um, Let me see if I can get the rest of this out. At home environment when a school is using blended learning.
Mhm. Well, then that's if the at-home learning is not working, then it's time for the expectation is that the IEP team meet to discuss why the learning is not working, and whether the student could receive additional supports and services at home that would allow that to work, or whether the student needs to have some services in person at the school building. And the IEP team needs to essentially determine what an appropriate placement is. That's kind of the reverse of what our topic was today, right? But it's kind of the same analysis. Um, you know, are we meeting the students' needs in that environment? If not, what other environment should we consider? Now, there may be some instances where there's an enforceable public health order that just makes it not possible for the district to implement an IEP in the way that the IEP team is determined as appropriate. In those circumstances, then you are in a case where the IEP is not being implemented. You can't violate the public health order to do so. So at that point, then you need to continue on the best you can with what you can do. And when you're in a position to provide those services in person again or within the school building again, then again, the IEP team needs to sit down and talk about, okay, what did we miss? And how are we going to, make up for what was missed?
Okay, I have
And
another
that's where you
one.
get into that additional
Oh,
services, compensatory services,
and
discussion. So.
I would guess that this next one that we have for you is kind of related to additional services as well. How can my
Mhm.
daughter get the extra help she needs in math? She was behind before COVID set in, and now she is really behind.
Mhm. Mhm.
What do we
Yep.
do?
Right. I'm going to sound like a broken record, I'm sure, but the IEP team needs to get together and talk about that. And does that mean that the student is going to get some additional specialized instruction in math? And when that's going to happen, that's all, excuse me, that's all for the IEP team to think about. Um, and that's going to be hard. It is going to be difficult to get students, back on track after all of this disruption. Um, but the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean that we don't have to talk about it. There's definitely an obligation, and that's with the additional services. The obligation is to look at where the student was, what the effect of the school closure was, where the student is at now, what the expectations are, and think about what additional services can be made available to that student to get them, back where they need to be as quickly as possible. And our guidance is that that particularly thinking about the closure last year, that discussion has to happen. It's required that that discussion happen within the first, I think we said 6 months, I think, of the time that school would have normally opened this year. So that discussion has to happen. The services don't necessarily, the additional services don't necessarily need to be provided within that time for kind of the practical reasons that I talked about. There's only so many hours in the day, right? So it may be that, going forward, we're adding some additional services. This might be the point at which you're considering extended school year services for the summer of 2021 in terms of, providing some additional specialized instruction, practice, whatever it happens to be, in order to try to, address that problem that this question raises.
So I guess this is a follow-up to the question that was just asked. Can the school provide a one-on-one tutor support now and in the summer? Is that something that the parent can ask for?
That is definitely something that can be asked for. Doesn't sound like an unreasonable request to me, but again, that would be the IEP team's discussion about whether that would be the appropriate way to address the student's needs.
And I guess a follow-up and a more generalized question to that is that many parents have concerns about how their students' additional needs will be addressed and what school districts will do in order to compensate for all these people that need additional services. Do you have any specific directions or suggestions to parents about how they could proceed if in fact they don't feel that at this point in time, with everybody asking for help, how they're going to get their portion of the help they need for their child?
So is that question contemplating if the IEP process has not produced a result that the parent thinks is appropriate?
I think that's the case. I think that parents
Mm-hmm.
are concerned at this point in time, saying that if and when things get better, and I have a list of all
Mm-hmm.
these areas where my child needs this extra help, will this,
Mm-hmm.
how informed will these IEP teams be to be able to provide the services? I mean, there's just so many resources that schools have.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, I don't think I know the answer to that question, to be honest. And I absolutely see what the concern is. And I will say, that's a concern of mine as well. Um, you know, I have not heard that there are additional resources forthcoming under IDEA or that kind of thing. And I'm not sure that's under consideration in Congress or the state legislature. Um, we might be looking to them for assistance. I'm sure the department has been advocating for that type of assistance. Um, all I can say is that the don't let the worry about scarce resources prevent you from asking for what you think is appropriate for your student through the IEP process. And yeah, I mean, you're probably going to hear from school folks that you know there we have all sorts of students that we need to try to address their needs. Or I mean, that's just going to be reality. But don't let that deter you from advocating for your student, because the individual in IEP is still part of the law. Um, the other thing that comes to mind is that in the course of this discussion about additional services, data is going to be very important. And as parents, because when students are at home in a virtual environment, you are the eyes and ears. You become a great source of data for the IEP team. So to the extent that you're making mental notes about how your child is reacting to particular types of instruction, how they're progressing towards the work that they're working on, your thoughts about where they are in comparison to, where your other children were at that stage in their school careers. All of that information is going to be very important in determining what additional services are needed. And it's, that information is going to be in your hands. So to the extent that you can bring that into the IEP team discussions, it is going to be helpful to your student, and also I think will go a long ways towards getting you the outcome that you think is appropriate. So.
And I think that this would probably be pretty close to our last question, but it follows up with that. And can you address where people can find again the additional services information that they might need to know about?
Yes, that's in the second document on this current slide. There's an entire
Actually,
section there on.
Sorry,
Did
Paul,
it?
if you could go back,
I
yeah,
went to
because
sleep.
yep, it
Okay.
went to sleep, yeah.
Let's see. We'll get started here. Oh, this one. So the one that says DPI guidance, there is an entire section on there on additional services, and it sets out what our expectations are for the special education or for the IEP teams in terms of considering that on a student by student basis.
And for those of you also interested in additional services, Wisconsin Facets for the start of 2021 will be providing information on additional services via another webinar in the first couple of months of the 2021. So that's just some information from our side that would be appropriate. And I guess at this time, I don't have any other questions for you, Paul. Do you have any closing comment you'd like to make?
Well, again, I appreciate you taking, all of you, and Bonnie too, taking the time to have me here today so I could talk about these issues with you. And again, I'll just reiterate that I'm happy to hear from parents, advocates, school people, whoever who have questions about these issues. Send me an email or give me a call. And I guess finally, I hope that you have the opportunity to go outside and enjoy this gorgeous sunshine today. I stepped outside a few minutes ago and it's quite warm and lovely out. So, I guess that would be it, Bonnie.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paul. And we really appreciate the information that you provided us today. I'm sure that those that participated have learned a lot, as I have as well. This will conclude our webinar for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets still has several webinars for the year 2020, and that our new webinars have just been added to our website for 2021. We will have over 100 webinars for 2021. Please check out the website calendar and register for any of the trainings that you're interested in. And also please watch for that short evaluation that will be coming your way after today's live presentation. Again, thank you, Paul, and thank you everybody for your participation today. Have a good day and stay well. Bye-bye all.